When we look back at Naruto, there's really only 3 jutsus that seem to have existed throughout the entire duration of the story. Those would be Substitution Jutsu, Transformation Jutsu, and Clone Jutsu. But while Substitution and Transformation Jutsu have remained relatively the same over the duration of Naruto, Clone Jutsu has not. What started out as the way to pass through the Ninja Academy by simply making a non-physical clone of yourself that's meant to distract or confuse your enemy, evolved into something much greater, much more complex, and much stronger, with over a dozen people taking the clone technique and adding their own flair to it. And by adding their own flair to it, creating their own personal clone technique. But how do these clones differ from the standard clone technique or the standard shadow clone technique? Who created these clones? Do these clones require more or less chakra than standard clones? Are they stronger or weaker than standard clones? In total, there is 13 separate types of the clone jutsu, with each one conferring its own specific set of abilities and weaknesses. The real question is, of these 13 different types of clone technique, which is the strongest and why? Well, we're gonna answer all those questions and more in a second here, guys, but first, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you guys want to see me clone myself, well, then you should pop on over to my other page, The Weeb Commander, where instead of talking about Naruto, I talk about every other anime in existence. I just caught up with the One Punch Man manga, so there's gonna be a lot of videos about that coming up very soon. Before we get into all that, guys, today we have a recurring sponsor to the page, BetterHelp. BetterHelp is one of my favorite sponsors because I vehemently stand on the take that mental health is just that, health. See, BetterHelp is a product that I use a lot. The life of a content creator is filled with highs and lows, and having to teach myself that my worth is not dependent on the amount of views I get is something that I did with the help of BetterHelp. But what is BetterHelp, really? BetterHelp is an online mental health service with licensed therapists who are trained to listen to and help you. You can talk to your therapist in an online private situation at your own convenience. And on top of that, BetterHelp's broad network of therapists, over 20,000 strong, can help you with any problem you might have. Every single one of those 20,000 therapists has a different range of expertise. Therefore, you can find the one perfectly suited to you. All you have to do is fill out a questionnaire to help assess what you might need. And you and your therapist can set times to schedule either video or phone sessions. And on top of this, you can send your therapist unlimited messages and everything you share is confidential. My therapist helped me realize that a lot of people out there enjoy my content for me, and therefore I shouldn't be afraid to explore as many anime as I please. But let's say the therapist you're matched with doesn't suit your fancy. You can request a new therapist at any time for no charge. So join the 3 million people, one of which is me, on their path to better their mental health with a licensed therapist from BetterHelp. Get 10% off your first month of BetterHelp at betterhelp.com/nchammer. Or click the link in my description. We all have struggles, and it's about time we worked on them. So, clone technique. How did something that started off so simple become so complicated down the line? What was once just a simple technique used by students trying to become genin to pass a test became a technique tweaked by Tobirama to create shadow clones, and then tweaked by other people to create different types of shadow clones using different elemental releases and things like that. And every single time the clone technique or the shadow clone technique was altered, it got stronger. But what's the story behind every single one of these variations of the clone technique? And where do they fall in the hierarchy of power relative to each other? Well, in order to answer that question, we're going to start this video off in the way that we tend to start these videos off, at the beginning, both in this circumstance chronologically and in terms of our weakest entry, because our first entry on the list is just clone technique. You see, clone technique is one of the 3 basic techniques that every single ninja has to know. And like I stated earlier, the Shinobi Academy of Konoha won't let students graduate unless they master this technique. And it was because of this fact that Naruto actually failed the exam 3 years in a row. Now, we don't know who created this technique because it's been around for a really long time, but these 3 core jutsu that every single ninja has to know have been principal to ninja lore for as long as ninja lore has existed. Ninjas turning into logs when they get hit is not an idea that Kishimoto created. The same with things like ninjas being masters of disguise and therefore using transformation jutsu, or in the case of clone jutsu, creating physical after images of themselves to confuse their opponent. These 3 things have been tied to ninjas for as long as ninjas have been an idea, and thus it was only natural that these be the 3 core jutsus of all the ninja in Naruto. But just because this is one of the core tenets of being a ninja does not mean it's powerful. This technique creates either 1 or 2 after images of yourself to your side, and these after images will do exactly what you do. They are essentially just mirror reflections of whatever you're doing. And while that's good for possibly confusing a low-level opponent or simply just catching them off guard, at anything above a low-level opponent, this jutsu is entirely worthless. See, the clones created actually have no physical shape. They're essentially just light particles that look like you, and thus these after images can't do any harm. On top of that, because these clones technically have no substance or form, they're kind of easy to pick out, because the grass beneath their feet won't get bent and the branches they bump into won't sway. Any ninja with the smallest amount of observation ability can simply just see,
oh, for some reason those versions of Sakura aren't bumping into anything.
On top of that, unlike with shadow clones, these after images have no chakra network. Therefore, any user of the Sharingan or the Byakugan would be able to see through them immediately. However, just because this jutsu is slightly useless doesn't mean that people haven't made effective use of it. And I'm not talking about the times that Sakura tried to use it in her battle against Ino and in the Forest of Death. That did not work. No, what I'm talking about is our first derivative of this list, because coming in at the number 12 spot is the Haze Clone technique. Now, the Haze Clone technique is a technique used by ninjas from the Hidden Rain. Well, at least Genin from the Hidden Rain. Genin from the Hidden Rain and the Forest of Death show off this technique as a massive upgrade to the clone technique that all of the ninja from Konoha know how to use. This technique is based off the fog that constantly hangs over the Hidden Rain village, and therefore is assumed to use water elemental release in order to pull this off, but never confirmed. But essentially the way that this is an upgrade of the clone technique is instead of 1 or 2 clones, there's hundreds. And these clones can actually move independently. They don't simply follow the movements of the caster, which is nice until you figure out that all of these clones can't damage you and therefore you really don't have to worry about them. But they do function very well as a distraction. Yes, obviously, it doesn't matter how many clones you make, none of them will ever be able to damage your opponents, but you can damage your opponent. And the caster of this jutsu usually waits underground for the perfect opportunity to strike. And since one of these clones could be the real person, you do have to take every single one of these clones somewhat seriously. So essentially the Haze Clone technique is just what multi-shadow clones is to shadow clones to the regular clone technique. And since we're talking about shadow clones, we should talk about shadow clones, because coming in at number 11 is shadow clones. Now, I've done a lot of ranking videos, and I gotta say that in all of the ranking videos I've ever done, the distance between these two numbers in terms of usefulness is probably the biggest gap I've ever had. The difference between the Haze Clone Jutsu and Shadow Clone Jutsu is insurmountably huge. The Shadow Clone Jutsu was created by Tobirama during the Warring States period because he wanted more people to help him kill Uchihas. And since he knew he was the best in the world at it, he figured it's best if there's more of me. The way that this technique works is that it just makes these clones real. Essentially, clone technique, not shadow clone technique, is most likely yin release, as in essence, the creation of this clone is sort of a genjutsu of sort. It's the creation of something that's not really there, which is exactly what yin release is. Shadow clone technique adds yang release, because if we think about it, shadow clone technique is imagining something yourself and then creating it and giving it physical form in terms of a body with a chakra network. You then split your chakra with however many shadow clones you have. If you create 2 shadow clones, you have a third of your original chakra, but so do your 2 shadow clones. Now, these shadow clones are just you, but that doesn't mean they have to do everything that you do. It's essentially just making a copy of yourself that can operate independently. So it's fuzzy on whether or not these shadow clones technically have free will. Like, they know they're shadow clones and they're very willing to give their lives for the main body, but whether or not they're being forced into those situations or they willingly choose to do it, we just don't know. Regardless, these shadow clones essentially allow you to double or triple or quadruple your fighting power, so long as you're able to operate fully at 1/3 or 1/4 the original amount of chakra you usually have. Now, shadow clones can incur a small amount of damage before disappearing. If a shadow clone is lightly punched or slapped or lightly kicked or something like that, they can survive. However, should a shadow clone take a substantial hit, they will disappear into smoke, and all of the chakra and experiences from that shadow clone will go back to the main body. So let's say hypothetically I had one of my shadow clones studying Mandarin Chinese for a couple of years, but the shadow clone gets shot in the back of the head in a Macau casino because he accidentally called a woman a donkey. I would get to learn Mandarin Chinese. On top of that, I would get back however much chakra I had split to that body. Listen, shadow clones being this low is a bit weird, and I'm willing to admit that, because for all intents and purposes, the power of a shadow clone is entirely tied into whoever is using the shadow clone. Naruto's shadow clone is probably stronger than any other type of clone on this list, but I'm talking about the strength of the technique, not the strength of those who are using it. Obviously, the fact that Naruto created 2 separate full Kurama shadow clones and then smashed them into each other to make an Ashura mode is quite powerful. But it's only that powerful because Naruto's that powerful, you know? Like, obviously, yes, being able to split a tailed beast chakra into multiple shadow clones is very cool, but that's more tied into the strength of the tailed beast than shadow clone as a whole. Everything from here on out is going to be a different iteration of the shadow clone. And the first different iteration of the shadow clone and the weakest iteration of the shadow clone is the water clone. See, the water clone was introduced to us very early on in the land of waves. And that's because the water clone is a specialty of the hidden mist. But honestly, it's not the world's best improvement over the shadow clone. In fact, I probably wouldn't fault you for saying that the water clone is significantly weaker than just a standard shadow clone. But for a couple reasons, and just because it's more interesting to talk about it in this order, I am going to be putting water clones above shadow clones here. See, water clones are created using the water of your surroundings, and therefore technically because a medium is being used from the surroundings, it does take a little bit less chakra than a shadow clone. But honestly, maybe we should have wanted to put more chakra into these clones, because while a shadow clone should technically be just about as strong as the caster, as it has the same amount of chakra as the caster, the same physiology, the same speed and strength, I mean not durability, but that's outside of the point, water clones are stated to be only 1/10 as strong as the caster. So if you're a Genin to begin with, any water clone you create is only gonna be 1/10 as strong as a Genin. Now, obviously, in cases like Zabuza and Kisame, this wasn't a huge issue. They had so much power to begin with that 1/10 of their power is still relatively formidable. But once again, we're talking about the technique here. On top of that, just like with a standard shadow clone, if a water clone incurs enough damage, they'll just revert back to water. But they do have a small advantage over shadow clones, at least in the anime in this regard. See, water clones in the anime were shown to, upon dispersing, actually create a mist field, as the water that's used to comprise the water clone is immediately turned into mist. On top of that, since these water clones are made using water, the caster of the water clone jutsu can actually use the water from those water clones for water jutsu. So let's say hypothetically you wanted to shoot some water bullets. You could use the water from your water clone and shoot water bullets out of their chest, which does give water clones a slight advantage in terms of surprise factor for attack power. However, for some reason, water clones also have a major detractor. See, water clones are the only clones on this list that can't be used from a far distance away. That is to say, if a water clone gets far enough away from its caster, it'll just disappear. As if the caster of water clone jutsu has to keep a constant flow of chakra to that water clone. This isn't a problem with any other shadow clone derivative on this list, and therefore, as far as shadow clone derivatives go, this is on the bottom. Coming in at number 9, we have crow clones. I'll give you one guess who uses crow clones. There's not really a whole lot to say about crow clones. They are essentially just shadow clones. However, Itachi wants to be edgy, therefore he decided to use crow clones instead of shadow clones. The real difference between crow clones and shadow clones, and the reason that crow clones are higher than shadow clones and water clones, is because it specifically stated that because Itachi is using actual physical living crows to create these clones, that it requires significantly less chakra to create a just as strong shadow clone. Now, this was most likely due to the fact that Itachi just did not have enough chakra to use shadow clones willingly, and therefore he had to find some backdoor alternative to creating shadow clones without overexpending his chakra. And since he was being followed by more blackbirds than Edgar Allan Poe, I guess he figured he could put them to use. But for all intents and purposes, this is just the shadow clone at a lower expense. But it does win style points. After crow clones, we have rock clones, which are also kind of just shadow clones, but they lose points for style. You see, rock clones are used by people from the hidden stone, and one would assume that a clone created from rocks would be more resilient and therefore wouldn't break upon taking a punch or a kick or any kind of jutsu. And while to a certain degree this is sort of the case, which is why it's higher than crow clones and water clones, to a certain degree it's also not the case. See, when a rock clone is hit, it doesn't go poof into smoke. That's only because it's not made of smoke. See, rock clones are made of, can you guess it? Rocks. So when they're hit with a significant amount of force, they crumble into rocks, much in the same way that a water clone will return to water upon being hit. Is it a possibility that it requires a little bit more power to break a rock clone over a water clone? We don't really know. Every time we've ever seen a rock clone hit with substantial enough force, they crumble. The real reason I'm putting rock clones higher on the list is because a rock clone, before it crumbles, would be able to stop a lot more than a water clone or a crow clone. Because punching a rock is significantly harder than punching water or crows, I think. I've never punched a crow. They could be hard. There was absolutely a temptation on my end, though, to put this lower because of how rock clones are made. Because for some reason, users of the rock clone can't just use the rocks around them. They have to spit a bunch of rocks out of their mouth to make into the clone. You telling me all 75 pounds of Inoki is just carrying around 3 tons of stone in him at all times? There are rocks everywhere. Just use them. Speaking of things that gross me out, next up on the list, we have the insect clone. This is entry number 7, by the way. I'd like to say, quick caveat, entries 9 through 6 are all just shadow clones, but a little bit fancier, so all interchangeable, really. The insect clone does have some specific advantages over regular shadow clones. It can take a bit more of a beating than a shadow clone because it is just technically thousands of Kikaichu stuffed together in the shape of a body. And I don't know if you've ever tried to swat a bug out of the air, but usually it doesn't kill them. So should somebody make intense physical contact with an insect clone, sure, it might disturb some of the bugs, but they can just fly back. Now, this doesn't mean that an insect clone is immune to damage. It's not. Much in the same way as a water or rock clone, if an insect clone sustains enough damage, it will break back into thousands of bugs. The reason that that's better than water or rocks is because these bugs are still under the Abarame's control. Like, sure, you've defeated my shadow clone, but you haven't destroyed my bugs, and I can still very much use them to attack you right now. And while one could absolutely argue that anybody who's using rock clones or water clones could use the rock or water generated from a water clone or a rock clone being defeated, with the Abarames, it's an immediate and very precise control. On top of that, with a rock clone, you have to spit the rocks out of your mouth, and therefore the rock clones are made around you. But since an insect clone is made using insects, an Abarame can place that insect clone wherever. All they have to do is direct a couple thousand insects in one direction, and then they can place the insect clone on top of a tree or a mountain or anywhere. So in terms of tactical advantage and reconnaissance, the insect clone is better than a rock clone or a water clone or a crow clone. Though I guess a crow clone would actually technically confer the same advantages as an insect clone. Like I said, all interchangeable. And that also applies for our next entry on the list, number 6. The ink clone. See, the ink clone is kind of a confusing entry because it's technically used by 2 separate people, but they use it in very different ways. See, the ink clone is used by Sai and Killer Bee. It's used by Sai because he uses ink to draw all of his paintings, and Killer Bee because of octopuses, octopi. Well, technically an ink clone is basically just a shadow clone, but made of ink. It's got some neat little tricks you can use along with it. Most specifically, a jutsu used by Killer Bee called Sealing Technique Octopus Hold. This technique is actually built around Killer Bee's use of ink clones entirely. This was a Fuon jutsu created by Killer Bee specifically for large military battles. Essentially, the idea behind this jutsu is that Killer Bee would create a bunch of ink clones, and these ink clones would flank other military forces. Upon coming into contact with these military forces, the ink clones would begin to glob onto the military forces, seeping their body or the octopus ink onto these enemies. And within 3 seconds, these enemy combatants would be completely covered in the octopus ink. Problem is, once you're completely covered in the octopus ink, you can never move again. The ink completely seals off all movements, and escape is impossible. Now, if Killer Bee could only do this on 1 or 10 or 20 people, that would be impressive. But it's stated that Killer Bee can use this technique on up to 1,000 people at a time, which means that if hypothetically Killer Bee found himself in combat against 1,000 people, he would be fine. As for Sai's ink clones, they're fine. And with that, we conclude our 9 to 6 middle section where everything could possibly be very easily interchanged. And with the end of that, we now come to our top 5. And starting off that top 5 is quite honestly a strong contender with Clay Clone. You see, Clay Clone is exactly what it sounds like. It's a clone created from clay, but specifically clay from Datara. Now, Clay Clone operates a lot like Earth Release Clone, which is gonna show up later on the list. Except there's one key difference between the Clay Clone and the Earth Release Clone. See, a Clay Clone is just a shadow clone made out of clay, which means that if enough force is applied to it, it will just revert to clay. But in actuality, that's its biggest strength. See, because these aren't formless lumps of clay. These are clay clones created in Datara's likeness by Datara, which means that after being destroyed, they'll just be kind of statues statues of Earth release clay. So should hypothetically somebody punch through this clay clone's chest like Sasuke did, Datara can see the moment that it happens and harden the clay around their fist. Now, if this was just regular Earth release, it's a cool little trap, but in Datara's circumstance, he can add explosive clay to these clones, meaning that essentially if you strike these clay clones with your own fists or feet, you are one, gonna get caught, and then two, get exploded. And this all plays perfectly into Datara's fighting style, as his clone jutsu is essentially just a new variation of his C1 or C2 attack. But since this trap and counter attack can just be nullified using lightning release, it's gonna be at number 5. But since we're talking about lightning release in clones, that brings us to our number 4 entry on the list, the Lightning Clone. The Lightning Clone is a really weird entry on this list. You see, a Lightning Clone just looks like a regular Shadow Clone until it gets hit. The Lightning Clone is a specialty of Kakashi, and for all intents and purposes, when Kakashi uses the Lightning Clone, it looks as though he's just using a Shadow Clone. It looks the same way, it functions the same way. That is until you defeat said Shadow Clone. Because when a Lightning Clone is defeated, much like every other type of clone, it reverts to what it's made out of. The Lightning Clone is made out of lightning. Upon being defeated, it turns back into lightning, meaning that anybody who came into physical contact with this Lightning Clone in order to defeat it is now getting shocked with a 6-foot tall body of lightning, which when you consider the fact that the Chidori is like this big and it managed to blow Rin's back out when Kakashi was 13, I don't know if I want that multiplied by like 17. I liked a battery in middle school and I still feel it sometimes. And the thing is, because there's really no discernible difference between a Shadow Clone and a Lightning Clone, this is an incredible trap to lay for anybody you're battling. One second you're punching a bunch of Shadow Clones and next thing you know it, you're getting shocked with 1,000,000 volts. Not to mention the creation of the Lightning Clone is possibly the most impressive feat of shape transformation we've ever seen to the lightning elemental release ever. Like when Sasuke used Chidori Sharp Spear and everyone was like,
Oh my god, he made his Chidori long.
Kakashi literally made a body out of lightning. But enough gushing about Kakashi, we need to get to an entry that I previously alluded to in talking about the clay clones, Earth Release Clone. Yes, this is different from the Rock Clone. See, the Earth Release Shadow Clone was first introduced to us through Orochimaru in his battle against Hiruzen. And the true strength of the Earth Release Shadow Clone is the fact that it doesn't operate like other Shadow Clones. See, every other Shadow Clone on this list, upon incurring damage, will turn back into whatever it's created from. That's not the case with the Earth Release Shadow Clone, however. The Earth Release Shadow Clone, upon being hit, actually regenerates, quite honestly making it closer to Edo Tensei than a Shadow Clone. I mean, obviously there's ways to destroy this clone, like fire release or water release, but it's basically immune to all physical attacks. And more than that, any user of this technique probably wants you to use physical attacks against it. Because much in the same way that Datara is able to trap Sasuke's arm in his clay clone, the same thing can happen with Earth Release Shadow Clone. We actually saw this happen in Boruto against Konohamaru. I'm just realizing I completely forgot Sand Clone. But quite honestly, I think that Earth Release Shadow Clones and Sand Clones are pretty close to each other in terms of strength, so we'll just call this a shared spot at 3. 3B, if you will. Sand Clones are also kind of a weird entry onto this list because Sand Clones, unlike every other clone on this list, look like Sand Clones. What I mean by that is things like the Lightning Clone or the Earth Release Clone or the Rock Clone all eventually look like the caster. And while Sand Clone does kind of look like the caster, Gaara in this circumstance, it's always very clearly made out of sand. And I would argue that's because the Sand Clone isn't really a clone. See, a Sand Clone doesn't really operate like a clone in any regard. I would say the Sand Clone is more just a physical representation of Gaara's offensive output and him channeling it in a way that makes sense to him. You see, because Gaara's Sand Clone doesn't turn back into sand upon being hit. Because Gaara's Sand Clone never really takes his full appearance, it's kind of just sand. And while obviously rock clones and lightning clones and everything else are just rocks and lightning being manipulated in a shape form, Gaara's situation is different. It's more just Gaara controlling sand in the shape of Gaara. However, because of this sand clone is very powerful. Any physical attack mounted against the sand clone can trap what was being used to attack, much in the same way as with any of Gaara's sand. When you hit it, it can reach out onto you and grab you. And because the sand clone is technically just Gaara's sand being manipulated, it can take as many hits as possible. If you kick its head off, you can simply just reform its head because it's not really a head, it's just sand in the shape of a head. So yeah, let's call it 3B because I'm still not even entirely sure that we can call it a clone. Something I am sure we can call a clone is what Madara referred to as the perfect clone, the Wood Clone. See, the Wood Clone is something that we've only ever seen Hashirama and kind of Yamato use. But for the sake of today's video, we're just going to be talking about it in the capacity that Hashirama uses it. See, the way that a Wood Clone is created is actually really cool. See, Wood Clones are actually created by a Wood-style user making their own cells into vegetation, which is why Wood Clones appear to grow out of Hashirama. He's turning his own body into wood to then make into Wood Clones. Since these Wood Clones are technically vegetation, they can also merge with plants and trees, meaning that you could just be walking past the tree one day and then boom, Hashirama's clones come out of it. This is incredibly good for assassination and reconnaissance. On top of that, since these clones are technically just Hashirama's cells, by placing his hand on the clones, he can change their shape. All of this, possibly most importantly of all, Wood Clones don't disappear when hit. I mean, if you like really hit them, they will revert back to wood, but they take a substantial amount more damage than any other type of clone. And therefore Madara refers to them as the perfect clone technique, because we all know that shadow clones have the exact same chakra network as the user. And now, on top of being indiscernible through chakra networks, you also can't punch them to find out who the real person is. Madara actually states that only he with his dojutsu can see through a wood clone, implying that nobody else on Earth will be able to discern who was the wood clone and who was the original. But since we're talking about Madara, we should get to our number one and very obvious number one pick here: Limbo clones. I wish I could just sit here and say that Limbo clones are just shadow clones in an invisible universe that's able to interact with the real universe, and only people with a Rinnegan or Sage Mode are able to see or even perceive. But somehow they're more than that. Limbo clones are what happens when Madara projects his shadow into a parallel universe called Limbo. The Limbo universe is a universe that coexists with the universe that everybody else is living in. And since these two universes technically coexist exactly on top of each other, things in Limbo are able to interact with things in the real world. However, the only person with access to this Limbo plane of existence is Madara, and thus the only thing that exists in Limbo are the things that Madara puts in Limbo. And in this circumstance, that's his Limbo clone. When Madara has one Rinnegan, he's able to put one of these shadows or Limbo clones into Limbo, but when he gets two, he's able to make 4. And every single one of these Limbo clones has all of Madara's abilities like every other shadow clone ever. So in essence, they are invisible and untrackable clones unless you have a Rinnegan or Sage Mode. On top of that, these clones can actually switch places with Madara. Let's say you're about to land a fatal blow on Madara, one of these clones can switch places with it. Very similar to Sasuke's Heavenly Hand power. Now, the only way to damage these clones that we've ever seen is using 6-path Senjutsu. We don't know if regular Sage Mode would work or if you need the 6 paths bit, which means essentially if you didn't just recently get a blessing from Ninja Sky Daddy, this is all but GG's for you. Really, the only downside to Limbo clones is that after a certain amount of time, they have to return to Madara, making them really the only entry on the list with a time limit. But they had to nerf this ability somehow. And this weakness is actually really what ended up undoing Madara, because Naruto was able to catch one of the Limbo clones. But once again, like I just said, if you didn't recently get 6 paths chakra from Hagoromo, this ability is gonna kill you. 4 invisible Madaras are just gonna shoot mouth lasers through your chest before you even know what's going on. And so yeah, obviously Limbo clones is coming in at number 1. And that's it. Every type of clone jutsu in Naruto ranked and explained. Do you guys like my explanations? Do you agree with my list? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. I like to think that I forgot Sand Clone because it's not really a clone.